are we today? I'm Dan Finley. I'm the Executive Director here at the Desert Caballeros Western Museum, voted by the readers of True West magazine as the best Western museum. How about that for Little Wickenburg? We'll take that. We certainly are very proud of that, and we're going to trumpet that everywhere we go. Before we begin the program, I'd like to ask Mrs. Kathy Clark to come on up, our Chief Advancement Officer, to talk to all of you for a moment about membership.
Thank you, Dan. Good morning, everyone. All right, who here are current members of the museum? Oh my goodness, round of applause. Nice, thank you all very much for your membership. I'm very excited to announce we are almost going to hit a milestone with our member count. We're about 10 away from 700 members. That's an all-time high, so thank you all for your support. If you know anyone that wants to become a member, send them our way. They will get a chance to enjoy a little more than 90 programs, including exhibitions each year. Like this fun program that we're about to hear today, you get previews also of the exhibitions before the public gets to see them too. So if you have any questions, you can ask me anytime, Monday through Friday, 9 to 5. I'm in the office over there. And myself or Tara Reed, we would be happy to help you with that. Also, just really quick, this Friday we have Dave Stamey coming in concert. Anyone here attending that? Okay, great, yes, all of us as well. This is his 7th year with us. He is a Western storyteller, songwriter. And actually the concert sold out right now. But if you want to take your chances, sometimes people do not show up when they purchase tickets. You're welcome to come the evening of the concert. The doors will open at 6 o'clock and the concert starts at 7. So we will be happy to see if we can get you seated, just in case some people don't show up. All right, thank you all.
Thank you, Miss Kathy. The history of the West is replete with myths and legends and tall tales. And I think much of that has been promulgated by Hollywood over the decades. And as a result, while the real West is full of wonderful virtues and values and attributes of individuals, Hollywood has bent them rather significantly, and it may make for a better movie, but it is not the real history of the West. We have with us today Dr. Eduardo Pagan, who is the museum's adjunct curator of history. He is also a full professor of history at Arizona State University, and he is going to dispel all those tall tales and legends and myths of the West. Without further ado, Dr. Eduardo Pagan.
Thank you. So to start off with, I love Westerns. So I just want to reassure you, I'm not anti-Western. This is not about dogging on any Westerns whatsoever. I love Westerns. I love Western movies. I love reading Western literature as well. My only point as a historian, though, is that when you dive into the history of the West, of this region, this land right outside our windows here, it looks different, and it looks different for some interesting ways. The mythology of the West, that's part of what makes the West so fascinating, is all the stories about the West. And there were fantastic things that happened, tragic things that happened as well. But the thing that I want to point out is the way that we Americans talk about our past, particularly the West, is really a product of how we like to imagine ourselves. Now, we're not unique. All people do this. All nations do this. And again, this is not a criticism at all, but it's just recognizing why there's such a disconnect between the real West, the West that we see out here, versus the Hollywood West, right? So I want to start off with this idea, and then we'll run through some tropes, some images, some themes that we see in all the Westerns. I'm going to start off with this idea that what makes a Western is really at its core a morality tale, a story between good and evil. That's really at the heart of all Westerns, whether it's movies, television shows, or books as well. It's a story between good and evil. Now, evil can be portrayed in a variety of ways. They can be banditos, bad guys, or think the Magnificent Seven, for example, right? They're banditos that are terrorizing a town. That can be evil. Evil can be just the weather and the land. Evil can have been at times portrayed as native nations as well, or just bad people. Think about High Noon, for example, right? And good is often represented by that person or those people that stand up to evil. Again, going back to High Noon, right? One good man standing up against bad people. There are many other stories, going back to Magnificent Seven. It's about banding the town together and we all rally to protect ourselves, right? I mean, so many of those stories are revolved around. In fact, as I'm thinking about it now, A Bug's Life, if you've seen that one, Pixar, A Bug's Life, it is a Western set among ants, right? Right? But it is at its essence a Western. It's the Magnificent Seven that's put in animation. It's fantastic. I watch it. It's a lot of fun. But that's really the core of the stories that make a Western a Western. Now, the reason I'm sharing this with you is that, a number of years ago, gosh, I think it's been, 7 years, 7, 8 years, right there. I started off writing Valley of the Guns. Valley of the Guns was a story about the Pleasant Valley War, if those of you know about that story. It's also known as the Graham Tewksbury Feud, and it took place in relatively northern Arizona, about where Young is, if you're familiar with the Rim Country. 1887 was really the peak period of violence. And so I began studying this Western, and I was curious, and as a writer, you've probably all read works of history that are probably dry as dust, right? Am I right? Yes. And as a writer, as one who wishes to really bring history alive, I enjoy dabbling in different genres. And so I wanted to make this history read more like a Western, right? And so I decided to set out on a study about what makes Westerns Western, right? Which is an interesting question at the task. What makes Western Western? Well, to begin with, the stories are set in the West. But it's not that simple. And I'll show you, in just a moment, I'll show you a reason why it's not that simple. The stories are set in the West. Stories are usually in a particular time period. So after the American Civil War, and they can come up to the present. Think about Cormac McCarthy's stories. They come up to the present as well. But they also have certain types of characters that you expect to see in Westerns. And as I said, at their essence, there is a struggle between what I characterize as good versus evil. So at its essence, that's what makes Westerns. So as I go through this, first of all, as I said, these stories are set in the West. I want you to think for a moment, there are many Wests. Now this is a legitimate question that Western historians ask themselves all the time. Where does the West begin? So if you go back early enough in American history, the West was everything west of Virginia, right? New York State, that was the West. Ohio was the West back then, right? So as settlement moved over time, the West changed. Generally speaking, most historians would say the West is west of the Mississippi, right? I mean, generally speaking. But even then, if you want to consider that the West, there are many kinds of West. Think about Montana. Think about Washington, Oregon. Very, very different than Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, right? Even Utah or California, there are many different kinds of Wests. And in those different areas, different economies, different settlements, different stories, right? So I want to begin off with this idea that there are many Wests, and that's where things get really complicated when you're thinking about stories that are situated themselves. Now, this is Monument Valley, and this is kind of the iconic image of the West, right? And I trace it to John Ford's Stagecoach. This is when John Wayne first started to come to the limelight as a lead actor, right? So Stagecoach. Now, of course, when you're a filmmaker, you want striking scenery, and I can't think of anything more striking than Monument Valley. But as you know, that doesn't even characterize the Wickenburg area, or the Phoenix area, or the Prescott area, or the Flagstaff. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. But that is often the image that has been used in Hollywood over time. It is a version of the American Southwest of Arizona. Often when you see towns are like this, they're kind of adobe buildings. This is actually down in Tombstone, as you know, the OK Corral right there. And there's some variation of this that you see in a lot of dramatic productions about the West. Now, again, as I said before, here's a map of the West. If you just cut the nation in half, we consider all of this. And again, I just want to call your attention to the Rockies. Colorado is a very different kind of geography, very different kind of economy, different stories in Colorado than what you would find up in Washington, for example, or Montana, or California, or Utah. So there are many, many kinds of West. That's the point that I want to share with you. And yet, the stories that we often hear told, and it's not to fault anyone, but just to recognize it, they situated in often the American Southwest. Now, to begin with, what makes a Western a Western? Cowboys, right? So here's something that I want to share with you. So we think about cowboys, we think about something like this. Now, for those of you who are old enough, you remember this image, right? This is the Marlboro Man, right? And this is a variation of something that's very, very typical. So to begin with, let's go from top to bottom. And to characterize how we look at this individual and recognize that he's a cowboy. You see, of course, the Stetson hat up on top. Notice the leather vest. That's not denim that he's wearing, but this is kind of quintessential or classic cowboy wear. This is another image. This is going back a little bit earlier from the 1960s, 1970s, about how the West is represented. So in this case, let's go from bottom and we'll go up to top. So I want you to note the pant legs relative to this kind of footwear that they're wearing. Okay, we'll come back to this in just a moment. I want you to notice that. And then as we move up, these are all variations of leather, buckskin. Notice the holsters where they ride on the hips. And then I want you to notice the hats. Now, this is what we typically think of as a cowboy hat, right? So, what makes a cowboy hat a cowboy hat? Well, it's creased in the middle often, and it's dimpled on the side, and it has a broad brim. Now, this is for my hat, I've flattened out the brim, but typically the brim can go up higher, and if you're a country western music star, then it's even curled up even more, but you know what I'm saying, right? This is kind of the classic cowboy hat. You see it, you recognize it. Here's what I want to share with you. This is relatively a modern fashion invention. Cowboys of the American West, and I'm thinking about the 1880s, 1870s, 1890s, did not wear hats that looked anything like this at all, right? I'll show you images in just a moment, but I want you to know this. And in fact, as you think about it, you might, if you're familiar with the representation of the West, you might recognize it. In the 1930s, when Tom Mix was very, very popular at making Westerns, do you remember the hats that Tom Mix wore? The 10-gallon hats, right? Very large brims. They look like sombreros, right? They really did. So very, very large brim, 10-gallon hats. Those were the hats that were popular in the 1930s. Move forward to the 1960s, 1970s, when Clint Eastwood came on the scene. The hats that were then represented largely Italian movies, smaller brims, flat top, right? Paul Newman, we'll see some images as well. So even the cowboy hat, which we think is iconic and quintessential, has changed over time. That's what I want to share with you. Thank you. I appreciate that. Appreciate the respect he's showing to my hat there. So there you go. So let's go back. And this is one of the things that I do as a historian. For me, the closest thing that I'll ever get to time travel is actually studying historic photographs. It really is. This is the closest thing I'll ever get to eyewitness view. So a couple of things I want to point out. So to begin with, you'll notice that these are all African-American cowboys. And we rarely see this represented in our popular media, but it's estimated that up to 1/3 of the American cowboys in the American West, and so we're talking about, post-1865 to about 1890, were African-American. 1/3, 1 out of every 3 cowboys. If you think about it, many of these free people leaving the South, where would they go to find relative freedom? Where institutions were not as inscribed, And social roles were much more fluid. You'd come out west. And where would you find work? Herding cattle or livestock of some kind. So to begin with, there's that. A couple other things I want to point out real quickly. If you notice the crowns of their hats, maybe one up here is creased in the middle, but they're largely not. They kind of look like the Tom Mix 10-gallon hats. They're not classic 10-gallon, but I just want you to point out the hats real quickly. Other thing as well is I want to point out his pants. So let's go back here for just a second. Notice how tight these pants are, right? This is a modern aesthetic. We wear our jeans much tighter, right? If you go back in time, the pants that they wore were much looser. They didn't have the variety of fits that we have today. They were often very standard sizes. And so I'll show you some images of what we now characterize as classic Western figures, and they had really baggy pants, and it's because they went to the store and just bought what was available and used the belt to cinch up, and so clothing was very, very loose. But the other reason why clothing was very loose is that if you're working out on a horseback all day long, and you're hopping off, you're getting back on, you don't want tight clothing. You want clothing that is looser, that will move with you, and so as a historian, when I look at images, and often I'll be asked, is this a historic image or not? I often look at the clothing, and how does the clothing fit them? If it's loose, it tends to be more authentic. Now, let's move on. Here's another one. Many cowboys were actually American Indians, and that's not often represented in our Westerns as well. Now, this is a picture from Wickenburg. Also, many cowboys were Latino, were Mexican. In fact, the cattle ranching industry that came into the United States from the American Southwest was introduced by Mexicans. And the cattle ranching industry was introduced by Mexicans, or was introduced by Spaniards into Mexico, right? And so much of the cattle ranching industry, if you wanted to find experienced hands, you would go to Mexico, and you would recruit up here. And so to this day, there are many cowboy terms, if you will, that have Spanish origins. Juzgao, for example, you might know the term juzgao. It's a slang for a jail. Juzgado in Spanish. A lariat comes from la reata, the rope, right? Chaparradas for chaps. We think rodeo for rodeo. Corral for corral. Even chuck wagon comes from cocina, kitchen, and they used to, one of the terms for chuck wagon was a cusi. Well, a cusi comes from cocina, right? And then that term changed over time to chuck wagon as well. So a lot of terms in ranching and horsing as well, horsemanship, come from actually Spain and Spanish culture and Mexican culture as well. Now, again, back to our Westerns, the way that we as Americans talk about our past and portray our past, a lot of this has been left out in our storytelling. A lot of this great cultural and racial diversity that existed in the American Southwest, and what I characterize as the historic or authentic West. You'll recognize this Lone Ranger, right? And Tonto, his trusty sidekick before. This story, The Lone Ranger, is actually based on this individual. This is Bass Reeves, who was a ranger. Now, a ranger was somebody who went out and looked for rustlers. Rustling was a chronic problem in the American West. When you've got livestock, particularly if you free range, rustling was an enormous problem. It's still a problem to this day. And so rangers were basically policemen that would go riding out and they would trace down where the livestock went. You can imagine if you're rustling a herd, well, they leave a lot of evidence behind, right? Hoof prints, droppings. You can't travel very far from water, and so they would go out and looking. But Bass Reeves was actually the origins of the Lone Ranger. And yet, I think there was one production, I don't remember where, I think there was one production that actually tried to retell the story of the Lone Ranger with an African-American protagonist. I don't remember the name of the show. But by and large, this is how we've kind of erased our past. He was a very significant figure of the past. Now, I already talked about cowboy hats, and I'm shown there as well. Now, here's where I'm going to show you some historic images of people that you recognize from the West. Jesse James to the left. This is Wild Bill Cody to the right. You recognize Billy the Kid to the left. I think I was drawing a blank for a moment. Bat Masterson to the right. So I want to point out, okay, so none of these individuals are wearing what we identify as cowboy hats. So this is where I get my conclusion. Billy the Kid is wearing a top hat. Bat Masterson is wearing a bowler. In fact, here's another image of Billy the Kid. What's he wearing? A top hat. That was what he enjoyed. These other individuals, this hat right here is known as a Hornberg hat, if you know your hats. This is what gentlemen would wear. It's not quite a cowboy hat as we're talking about, but notice the other hats. This looks like a bowler. The short brims, there's no creased crown at all. And these are images from the historic West. Here's one last thing I want to share with you real quickly, lest I get into the weeds. Notice the jacket. And again, this is when I authenticate images, this is what I look for. So the jacket that I'm wearing right now is very much a 20th century, 21st century kind of jacket. So in other words, the shoulders are padded, right? And so it's done in such a way to give me more of a V look, right? This is every suit jacket you buy will do that. They didn't do that back in the Old West. There was no padding whatsoever. And so their clothing tended to be more tightly fitting, and as a result, you got more creasing that went on as well. And so these are the kinds of things that I look at to authenticate an image. This gentleman, unfortunately, he was being displayed as a disincentive to anyone else who tried to rob a bank, and so he is in his coffin before they put him in the ground. But here's what I want you to notice. Notice the hat. Right, now there is something going on here, but this is what I want to point out. When I look at hats that were worn back in the West, they tended to be unformed hats like this, right? So the crown is not creased at all, it's not dimpled, the brim is not shaped in the slightest. And again, if you think about it, I mean, we've all been in the American West long enough to know that when you go outside, you want as much protection from the sun as possible. So you want a brim that is broad, that protects you from the sun. And also having a higher crown also provides a layer of insulation from the heat, right? And so for those who were working outdoors, their hats tended to be pretty much like I'm demonstrating right here. In other words, they're unformed. They're bought from the store without being formed by a hat maker at all. And that was it. Now here's the other thing that I find very interesting. We often think about Clint Eastwood was, I think, one of the first that kind of brought the brim all the way down like this, right? I think he was the first one that started to popularize this. I often see hats like this, worn like this, which is, I find very, very interesting. And maybe they're positioning it relative to the sun, but notice where the hat is sitting on all of their heads. And that is something that I find very, very common, is a hat worn like this. You never see that represented in any of our Westerns whatsoever. Right? All right, now here's another image I want to share with you. Here we go. Again, but my point is very, very broad brim, kind of like a sombrero. And because these are working men, they're out in the sun all the time. They want the maximum protection possible. This is a Remington. Frederick Remington actually went out to the West. He studied, he lived among cattlemen as well, and he painted what he saw and noticed the brim. In fact, this is another as well. That's another curious thing that I haven't done it to this hat, but I see this rather often, is the front is bent back. And I don't know exactly why, but I see that often. And again, about the only time that I've ever seen that represented was, if you remember Gunsmoke, I think Festus had his hat like this, right? If you remember Festus. Now this is a picture from my boys in the Pleasant Valley War. This is in my book, but I want to kind of walk you through this again so you have a sense of what's going on. So notice the hats to begin with, very, very broad brims, pushed back somewhat on the head. Now here's something else I want to point out. This may be buckskin here. This is Tom Horn, if you know your Western figures. This is Ed Tewksbury to the left, and this is his brother Jim to the right. Now, with Jim, let's start over here. I want you to notice the positioning of his holster. So you see the belt? It's above the hip bone. So notice then where the handle of his pistol is falling. It's about mid-bicep, right? There's a reason I'm pointing this out, but I don't want to point that out. So there's that, and I'll come back in just a moment, but notice to our right, he's got a pistol that's shoved into his pants, and that's what I see most often. Because again, these are working young men. They don't have a lot of money. To have a leather holster costs money. And so often what they would do, and I just want to let you know, don't panic anyone, this is foam, rubber, and plastic. Right? So I mean, please don't. But I brought this, don't worry, I brought this for display purposes. This is what I find most often. They couldn't afford a holster, so they would do this. That was most common that you'll see. So there's Jim. Notice Ed. Pushed in right there. Notice over there, gun pushed into their pants. Now, accidents did happen. They did. And we'll read about that in just a moment. Let's see if there's anything else I want to point out from this. So the hats, the positioning, the broad, the kind of sombrero-looking hat as well. Oh, notice the facial hair. Mustaches were very, very common. They were in vogue. Not beards, not goatees, not weird sideburn kinds of things. Mustaches is really what was fashionable. And here's the last thing I want to point out. So this is J.D. Hogue, for those of you who know your Arizona history. He does have long hair, but it was very rare to find someone with long hair. Why? Because again, if you've ever spent any time outdoors, particularly a long amount of time, and you have long hair, oh my gosh, it's a pain to take care of. Even if you're not outdoors. I used to have long hair in my younger days. I think it came down to about here. And I finally got rid of it because I got tired of the care, honestly. Conditioner all the time, you're worried about split ends, the list goes on and on. Long hair is really difficult to take care of. It really is, for those of you who've had long hair. And so this is the hairstyle that I see most common. Why? Because when you have short hair, it's really low maintenance. You don't have to worry about brushing, and it's much easier to take care of when you're out days on end out in the range. We want to have things as easy to take care of as possible, and that's why being clean shaven often, this is what I see most often, not beards, not goatees or things of that nature. Now, Western wear. This is kind of modern Western wear right here. You're all familiar with this look. If you go to Sheplers, for example, and you see some really high-end Western clothing as well, you'll find things of this nature. Even historic reenactors, this is what you'll find. And I do want to say this, and again, it's not to call anyone else, and I hope nobody knows anyone in that picture. I hope so. This is not to call anyone else out, but I do give them credit for their pants relative to their boots. This is what I find most often, is the pants tucked into the boots. Why? Because this stovepipe part of your boot is what protected your legs when you're on horseback and you're riding through Western terrain that is very unforgiving, right? And so this is what I find most often is this. So I give them a lot of credit for remembering that. Let's see, someone else. This is a good Western hat. Over here as well. The dimpled one, not so much. Again, the facial hair, it's probably the closest that I've seen to Western images. In terms of pants, this is probably closer to historic in terms of notice how loose and baggy it was. And again, that's what you want if you're getting up and up on a horse and off on a horse, and you need to have mobility. All right, now, some of you might recognize this picture. Walter Matthau, Barbra Streisand, Hello Dolly. There's a reason why I'm sharing this with you. When you think of the Old West, it is represented by John Wayne and Clint Eastwood, and I don't know who else that we could throw up here. Lots of Westerns. 1950s were classic Westerns, so everybody was in the Western. Dean Martin, the list goes on. Was Frank Sinatra having a Western? Was he? Okay, do you remember the name of the movie? I'm just curious.
He was part of the dirty, it was a Western with Dean Martin and...
Okay. All right. I'll have to go back and take a look at that, Dean Martin. So here's the reason why I'm throwing this up. At the time of the West that is portrayed in our classic Western movies, this is what's happening in the East and in the Midwest as well. My point is, in showing this out, is that when you cross the Rockies or you cross the Mississippi, it wasn't like there were stores where you could trade in your Eastern clothing for Western clothing. Didn't happen. Stores in the West sold what was available, and what was available were suppliers in Philadelphia and New York City and other parts of the country. And so they dressed much more like that women and men than that, right? But this is the way that we have developed representing the West, with the leather and the earth tones and of course the greased hats as well. But let me show you an image. This is an image from Tombstone. So this is a group of townspeople gathered around the Tombstone epitaph. And notice what they're wearing. We'll start from top to bottom, right? Bowler hats, ties, three-piece suits. I'm trying to see if anyone has a beard beyond a mustache. No. They are dressed pretty much like people are dressed in Chicago and Philadelphia and on and on and on. Here's another image I want to share with you of the West. Stagecoach. Notice the bowler hats up on top. This was what I find most often in studying historic images. Again, it's not the leather, it's not the denim. They're dressed pretty much. Now, these are prospectors that are going out to prospect. And they're dressed for working outside. But even then, you see some of the things that I've been talking about. So the hat's tipped back, the brim tipped up as well. And they're ready to work outdoors. But again, it's not anything like we think about Clint Eastwood or John Wayne or some of those classic images. Now, here's another thing I want to share with you. This is another Western, and where I find this so common. It's earth tones. All the clothing that are represented, they're all earth tones. Browns, tans, grays, things of that nature. The real West was actually far more colorful. Now, this is a colorized image. But this is what I find most often. When you look very, very close, you'll see patterns, you'll see colors as well. Western wear was far more colorful. It wasn't always browns, dirty browns, right? No, it was very, very colorful wear as well. This is a reproduced or a colorized image of Billy the Kid. A couple things I want to point out. Notice where his holster is sitting above his hip, not down below. I'll come back to that in just a moment. But he's actually wearing a cardigan sweater. A cardigan sweater, Billy the Kid, right? And a kind of a halfway smashed top hat as well. So this is, and again, you think about it, these are working people, they wore what they could get. And there were no country western stores at all, right? You couldn't go and get, you could walk in and say, I'd like some cowboy wear. They would have no idea what you're talking about. So we talked a little bit about facial hair, and you'll see this as well. And there is a kind of antiquity and old school feel to this, but again, I don't find it, and it's largely for reasons, as I shared with you before, that if you're out working on the range, you want to be as carefree as possible. And what's more carefree than a clean-shaven face? And short hair as well. Now, cowgirls, right? This is one that we're often very familiar with. This is a modern interpretation of Western wear. If you go back in time, this is what they wore in the 1870s and 1880s. No jeans, no pants, dresses. The kind of dresses you would expect. In fact, you could take any one of these figures. This is Olive Oatman to the right, who was kidnapped by Mojaves, and she's tattooed on her chin as well. Any one of these women, you could plop them down in Philadelphia and nobody would blink an eye, right? They would blend right in. This is what I find. Notice this picture of this sod home. No one is wearing jeans. No one's wearing pants of these women. They're all dressed in skirts. Fashionable clothing of their day. This is very, very common. Notice this woman here who can bring home the bacon and fry it up in a pan, right? You remember that old. Here she has felled a buck. No, she's about to harvest it, right? So you notice the knife in her hand, right? She is wearing a skirt and a bonnet. You know what I'm saying? So, yeah, this is the way that they dress even when they're out doing really, really hard work. Now, let's get back to the fast draw. This is why I brought my prop. We're so familiar with this image where a disagreement takes place, taken out the street, they go on out there and they stare at each other, they wait for the other guy to move first, right? Part of the reason why it didn't happen is because if you do that, you have the chance of dying, right? And they knew that. They weren't stupid, right? The classic way in the Old West of killing someone that you had a disagreement with was to shoot them in the back. That way they couldn't draw on you, and if you're lucky, you can get away. That was the classic image. They didn't stare down. Now, occasionally there were moments that looked more like the classic duel, right? Where they would count on paces and then turn. This is a custom coming out of the South and out of the East. So occasionally there were moments like that. But not the ones that we've grown up with they would, stare at each other and wait for the other person to twitch or something like that, right? Here's the reason why. So modern holsters are much like this. And if you notice where the firearm sits, it's really right on the thigh. It sits so low, as a matter of fact, that you've got to tie it off. And if you've ever worn a holster like this, and you know that a firearm is, I don't know what, 4 or 5 pounds, what do they weigh? 3? 2 to 3? Oh my gosh, they feel like 5 pounds to me. But all right, thank you, about 2 to 3. But nonetheless, you know that if you're walking, this thing is flopping all over the place like this, right? And the other thing as well is that if you're sitting on a horse and you've got a pistol this far down, what's likely to happen, right? It's going to fall out. And so this is one of the reasons why this is a much more modern invention. And I want to come back to this. I want to point out, this is Jim Tewksbury. Notice this is a post-Civil War firearm. And as I said before, notice where the holster falls. It's almost up to his armpit. And so what is not going to be happening, he's not going to be doing a fast draw, because it's just not going to happen. If anyone wanted a fast draw, they usually did a cross draw. This is how they would do it. But again, there's none of this, because it's just not possible. And the reason why they wore their holsters up around their hip bone was because, again, when you get on a horse, it's more likely to hang down as opposed to fall out on your thigh. So here's another image right here of this woman. Notice how high this holster is, and this is what I'm trying to demonstrate, right? So that's what was far more practical. Pistol handling as well. So let's see if I can get this. There we go. I want to get this to play. So this is another part of Westerns that we're so familiar with, right? The gun twirling, right? The gunslinger. So I want to roll this. This is from Tombstone. And then I want to share with you something from the Old West. Now this is a dramatization, but I want to share with you why. I'll talk and tell you why I find it important.
How are you traveling?
After a moment from our sponsor.
The sponsor's silenced for now.
Thank you.
Thanks, Kate.
Sit at my table.
Mr. Rookie, you might sign your autograph.
That's up as high as it goes. It's the representation. You'll see in just a moment.
Wide earth, huh? Heard of you.
Listen now, Mr. Kansas law dog. Law don't go around here. Savvy?
I'm retired. Good. That's real good.
Yeah. Yeah, that's real good, law dog, because law just don't go around here.
Yeah, I heard it the first time. Winner to the king, $500. Shut up, bud. You must be Doc Holliday.
That's the rumor.
You retired too?
Not me. I'm in my prime.
Yeah, you looking.
You must be Ringo. Look, darling. Johnny Ringo. The deadliest pistolier since Wild Bill was saved. What do you think, darling? Should I hate him?
You don't even know him.
That's true. I don't know, there's just something about him. Something around the house. I don't know. Reminds me of me. No, I'm sure of it. I hate him.
He's drunk.
Vino Veritas.
Ajay Gurajis.
Creda Judas Sotella non ego.
Juventus Statora.
They're insulting each other in Latin and Greek.
Pace requiescata.
Come on, boys. We don't want any trouble out here, not in any language.
That's Latin, darling. Evidently, Mr. Ringo was an educated man. How I really hate him.
What's that, Johnny? I hear he's real fast. Drinks are on me.
There we go, okay. So, you're all familiar with this, right? The gun twirling, this one was getting pretty close to the baton twirling, you know, that kind of thing, right? This is the reality. This is from the Clifton Clarion in January of 1886. And let's read this together about why this kind of thing didn't happen. And if you think about it, it makes sense. The idiocy of fooling with a loaded revolver was never better illustrated than in the case of a Mexican named Patricio Montoyo, who accidentally shot himself last Sunday at the wood camp about 4 miles from Clifton. The account as given at the coroner's inquest held on Monday by Dr. Preen is that he was sitting down and fiddling with his six-shooter. Taking it in his hand, he essayed to whirl it on his finger, right? In some unaccountable way, as usual in such cases, it went off, the ball passing through the stomach to the lungs. He died Monday at 4 a.m. and was buried Tuesday at 1 p.m. He was 23 years old, single, and a native of East Lefton, Texas, where he has a mother now living. I mean, you know this. I mean, if you're familiar with handling firearms, you don't play with them. Because bad things do happen, or accidents do happen. And so, you know, it's, again, as I said, it's a classic feature of Westerns, but no, the West was very different. I want to share with you saloons very quickly. We're very familiar with this kind of scene, a saloon on the corner with the iconic swinging doors, right? This is a very, very classic scene. This is what I find in my research, is that saloons tended to be really small affairs. In fact, the rooms tended to be long and narrow. So it wasn't anything like we often see in Westerns where there are these large cavernous rooms and pianos playing and all of these kinds of things. Notice the bowler hat over here. Notice the straw hat over here, the boater hat, right? Again, this is from the Old West. In fact, I want to show you a picture. This is from Whiskey Row in Preston. So this is the courthouse that's right there. And right across from the courthouse is Whiskey Row. And yes, as a matter of fact, every time the legislators would take a break, they'd go over to Whiskey Row. And I guess legislate or something. Anyway, but here's what I want to point out to you is notice how long and narrow the buildings were. That is what I find all the time, is that saloons were these really long and narrow affairs. So here's the other one I want to share with you. Saloon girls, classic image. If we think about today, if you go to any kind of Western reenactor photography studio, and you would want to, do a sepia tone picture, often this is the clothing that you will find, right? So it's the ostrich feathers, skin galore, all this kind of stuff. This is another image. Marilyn Monroe, you'll recognize her as well in this Western. Here's the problem with all the Westerns that I see. In fact, I say the same thing about this statue that we've got out here in front of, the one where the saloon girl's standing out, she's talking to the caballero. Yeah, it's across the street. What's the Barcena, thank you. Same thing about the saloon girl out here. She's far too pretty, and she's far too skinny. Marilyn Monroe, you look at her, she's probably what, size 0 dress, size 2. This is what's common. And in fact, in the course that I teach, we do this kind of history of how Americans celebrated the human body, both male and female, and how they were dressed over time. When you go back to the 1880s and 1890s, their idea of a beautiful woman was far different. This is much more Rubenesque, if you will, full-bodied women. They did not look at thin women that we see today in Hollywood and think, wow, that's a striking woman. No, it was full-bodied women. That's what they really valued in that time period. This is Big Nose Kate, who was believed to have been a companion of Doc Holliday, and sometimes she ran a brothel up in Prescott as well. And I share this with you. If you think about it, she was very successful as a brothel owner, and she was known for her nose, right? Big Nose Kate. So again, they had a very different idea about what was attractive. As a matter of fact, they didn't care, to be quite honest. This one is actually Mustache Mary. That's how she was known, was Mustache Mary. Very successful brothel owner. Here's another image of a brothel owner from Denver as well. So again, their ideas of beauty were very different than what we think of as beautiful, even though this is a much older picture, but you understand what I'm saying, right? They had very different ideas of what was attractive and what was beautiful. Oh, here's another image I want to share with you. This was the madam up here. See if you can make her out. And these were her girls. Notice the way they're dressed, and that's another thing. Again, if you think about saloon girls with the ostrich, clothing off the shoulder and things of that nature, no, you won't find that at all. This is an actual picture of a brothel, and these are the workers in the brothel. Notice they are covered from head to toe, and this is not uncommon. They dress like respectable women of the day. This is another image of a brothel up in Alaska, fully covered. Right? They're not showing off their shoulders or anything like that. That was just over the top. If you went back in time, fully dressed, fully covered. This image here, and I share this with you for a reason, is that often what happened when a photographer would come around and you owned a business or a home, everybody would come out and they would sit out front, right? You see those images where they put the chairs out, they're going, that's what's happening here. This is a brothel as well. And the girls are coming out because the picture's taken, the musicians are coming out as well. But usually, and unless a photograph is being taken, this was not allowed. And the reason I'm sharing this with you is this is a classic scene in many Westerns where the protagonist is riding down the street and there are women hanging out the brothel, calling to them, inviting them up and things like that. That was illegal. It was illegal in all parts of the West. A sex worker could not advertise. In fact, if she was seen in a window, she could wind up in jail. Could not advertise at all. So they were not hanging out the window, calling to customers. This was only for the purpose of this photograph being taken. So, yeah, there we go. And, in fact, I may even add to this as well. Classic Western scene, right? You're on your way to the saloon. There's the brothel, there's the saloon. Many Western towns actually created red light districts to get them away from downtown, from the civic area, from schools, and created their own red light districts. And if women were caught, working women were caught outside of those areas, they could be arrested as well. Here's one thing I want to wrap up very quickly, is that we often think about Westerns where horses galore. Everybody rides horses everywhere. This is actually more closer to the truth. Bicycles. And again, the only Western I can think of that did this was Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. If you remember that scene, they're playing around on the bicycle as well. Bicycles were so common. Phoenix was known as a bicycle town. And if you think about it, it makes sense. If you have ever had horses or had to care for horses, they're expensive and they require a lot of care, right? You've got to be cleaned, you've got to be fed. If you're riding it out, you've got to put it in a livery somewhere, stable. Bicycle costs next to nothing for maintenance. And so bicycles were much more common in the Old West than horses. Now, industry, I want to just say this very quickly. We think about ranching. When we think about the West, most of our stories revolve around ranching. And I think it's because there's something terribly romantic. If you look at images of people on horseback and they're driving cattle, that was actually not the dominant industry of the West. Does anyone know what the dominant industry was? You want to just take a guess? Mining. It was exactly mining. Far and away, hands down, mining. Think about trying to write a romantic story about mining. Doesn't quite work. You know, one of the things that make our Westerns so fun are the opening themes, the sweeping music, right? The Bonanza theme is the Cartwrights are writing, that's what adds to all of this lore. But the truth of the matter is that it's really hard to write a romantic story about mining when you're digging a hole in the ground, right? That's not really romantic, but this is in fact far and away the major industry of most Western states, certainly here in Arizona. This is placer mining as well. Now I want to end up on this point, 2 points actually, so let me end up with this. This is a map of the Phoenix, the Salt River Valley. Here we are, up here in Wickenburg, right up there. Here's my point. Mining was so important to Arizona history, Phoenix would not be Phoenix were it not for the Vulture Mine in Wickenburg. And the reason I'm telling you this is that if you notice, Western towns are all laid out on the grid. So you see the streets running north, west, and south. I'm doing this backwards, sorry. North, south, east, west. And the only road that goes off in a diagonal is this one, State Route 60, right? The one that leads from Phoenix into Wickenburg. If you follow this all the way down to Phoenix, it takes you to the Five Corner area. That was the heart of the business district in Phoenix. And the reason why this road was cut was because when Vulture Mine at its peak was operating at highest level, there were over 2,000 miners living here. And so for those of you who are familiar with the land in this area, this is not great farming country. Part of the reason Hacienda is not a dependable source of water year-round. It's not great farming country. And so Henry Wickenburg had a problem. They needed to feed the miners. So Wickenburg teamed up with this former Union/Confederate scout, Jack Swilling. He did serve on both sides, by the way, during the Civil War. And Jack Swilling had this crazy idea. As he was a scout in the Salt River Valley, and if we went back in time in the 1870s, 1875, Phoenix was probably about 250 people. Half of them were Indian or Mexican, and the other half were Civil War expatriates. Tiny, tiny little village. Jack Swilling had this idea. As he traveled around, he noticed these canals that had been dug out by the Hohokam, right? So about 4 feet deep or so, about 8 feet wide. And he had this idea that if they could re-dig out those canals, they could then get water from the Salt River to flow out and flood this flat land in the valley, in the base of the valley, right? And that's what happened. Henry Wickenburg underwrote the money for Jack Swilling to pull together a group of men to start excavating out the canals. And that's why Phoenix began to grow. That's why we have Glendale, that's why we have Peoria, that's why we have Buckeye. Buckeye was created, if you notice the water here, to recruit farmers from where? Does anyone know? Buckeye State? Ohio, exactly. Peoria, Peoria is not on the map. The reason why Peoria, Arizona is named Peoria, why? Because they recruited farmers from Peoria, Illinois to come out here. And so they created the growing fields of the Phoenix metropolitan, what is now the Phoenix metropolitan area, in order to feed the miners up in Wickenburg. And so the wealth, the gold that came out of Vulture Mine went all the way down this road, and this is where they would pick up supplies, and then they would go back up to supply the mine as well. And that's what allowed Phoenix to begin to grow and become a commercial area in the territory. Last thing I want to end up on is this, is the word cowboy, as well as we're talking about the West. So we so often refer to people who rode on horses as cowboys. If you went back in time, nobody would say they were a cowboy. This is not a term you would use if you liked somebody. It was an insult. You would call them a drover, you would call them a cowpuncher, you would call them a cattleman, a number of things, a horseman as well, but you wouldn't call them a cowboy. And it's because if you went back in time, cowboys were considered about on par with what gang members are considered today, right? Let me read to you, and I'll finish up with this. Let me read to you an editorial that was complaining about the number of cowboys that were in Arizona, right? And so it says here in Arizona, we certainly have the bad ones. So the editorial acknowledged there's some good cowboys and bad ones, but we have the bad ones. The cowboys make their headquarters in some out-of-the-way place where their actions are not apt to be observed. They will start out on mysterious journeys and return with strange cattle and horses. Rustling, in other words. Thieving, right? Civilization and cowboys do not assimilate. While alive, they add nothing to the advancement and happiness of the world, and no one mourns their death. Right? And so that was a common attitude in the Arizona Territory and around the American West towards cowboys because they were associating with stealing people's livelihood. right? And so you wouldn't call someone a cowboy. That was an insult. As I said, you would call them a cow puncher or drover or something else like that. So with that, I will end. And again, I just want to reinforce, I love Westerns. I love it. It's a way of telling stories, but they're not documentaries. So I'll just end with that. So if there are any questions, I'll be happy to try and answer some. Yes?
White hats, black hats. And traditionally, there were the good guys wore the white ones.
Yeah.
But then I understand it changed, maybe after the Second World
Yeah,
War.
yeah.
So is there any story to that?
No, it's a great question about white hats, black hats. You know the symbolism, right? Good guys versus bad guys. So again, going back to some of the images that I've looked at in the American West, lighter hats really didn't exist. Most hats tended to be dark. So, you know, this idea that the lighter hats, probably Stetsons, something like that, they were worn by the good guys. Most hats tended to be black, like this was a standard color. So that was much more of a creation, as you identified, in the post-World War II period, World War II period, when we began to crank out all these Westerns, all these great stories. So thank you for that question. Anything else? Yes?
I want to add, what people wore, I read somewhere that particularly the miners
Yeah.
really were when they were immigrants.
Yes. Yes.
So they came from England or Ireland or
Right.
whatever. Thus the dirty.
Yes. Yes.
As they call it.
Yes. Yes. So
All that.
that's absolutely true. And so he's pointing out that many of the miners in particular were recruited from Wales, also recruited from Mexico, where the mining industries were well established. And so when they came here to the American West, particularly here in Wickenburg, they wore what they wore back home. And so you would find the derby cap and all these other kinds of clothing, and not, you know, again, what we would commonly associate with the West, the kind of typical clothing that we consider to be Western clothing as well. They were immigrants. Last thing I'll add, and I appreciate that, again, if we could go back in time, based on census data, if we went up to the Vulture Mine at any period, 1870, 1880, and heard English speaking, it would be spoken with a strong foreign accent, either Swedish or English or something of that. German as well. Germans were probably the fourth largest group that came to Arizona. So a lot of people were from somewhere else and brought their cultures with them. So thank you for that. All right, any other questions? Do I have a favorite Western? Oh my gosh, I do. Look, this is my guilty pleasure, okay? Quick and the Dead. Do you know this one? Sharon Stone in all leather. Sharon Stone plays a kind of Clint Eastwood character. Gene Hackman, if you know this one as well, that's my guilty pleasure. I love it. I love 310, the remake 310 to Yuma with Russell Crowe and Kristen Bell. I love that one. Again, but it's a story about a dad and his son, right? And Russell Crowe kind of redeems himself. Oh my gosh, I love, I was getting this one mixed up. Kate Blanchett and Tommy Lee Jones. It was a remake, and I always get the title mixed up. Was it The Searchers? Or was that the John Wayne story? It's a remake? So The Searchers was John Wayne, and then the remake was The Missing. That's what it was, The Missing. I love that one. So this was a Ron Howard production, and they worked really hard to get things right. Really hard. To the point, to the extent that the Apaches that had kidnapped the girl, they learned the local dialect out in San Carlos on the reservation. And so they worked really hard to get that right. And I love the fact that Kate Blanchett, in order to speak to both Indians and whites, she often spoke Spanish. She was not a native Spanish speaker, but Spanish was a common language that everyone spoke in the Old West. And that's how she was able to then do her thing, right, as a character. But I love that movie. Thank you for that. I could go on, but yeah, thank you so much. So, all right, thank you, everybody.